Greetings all, welcome to another session here of Tuesday Talks. Today we're going to continue our discussion of language assessments, and specifically today we're going to talk about designing a language test. Now, in order to do that, there are a number of things that you need to keep in mind and have ready so that when you're developing the test you can have all these pieces in place. You also need to recognize some of the things that you'll need to do after questions are made so that you can verify that they are indeed reliable. Okay, let's begin just by talking about the purpose and objectives, talking about some specifications for tests, talking about what items are going to be on the test, how they should be set up, multiple choice items in particular, and then talk about administering the test. Now, before we begin and we start looking at the purpose of a test, we should be asking a variety of questions. First and foremost, do we need to take the test? Is it necessary? Do I need to make this test? And if I do, what's the purpose? What am I using this test for? Please tell me that you're not going to just do it because you need to have a grade in your grade book. You need to have a purpose for the test that's actually going to help the students and you, the teacher, guide the course and guide the learning. And so that's also part of the question here. How's the test related to the course? What's the connection? Hopefully, not hopefully, it should be related to the course objectives. So make sure that that's the case. Is this a formative or a summative test? Rather simple question. Is this test is the test a gateway that has to be passed in order to progress? So, for example, a formative type of test might be this way. In order to progress out of the ESL program or to a higher level, you have to pass this particular test. Is that what this is? Okay, if it is, then of course there are different things that you need to be thinking about as you go through this process. A formative test can be less rigid. A summative gateway type test needs to be more formalized, and you need to make sure things are more in place and reliable. Next one, will the test provide washback? You're going to make sure that students use this test to improve and know what they need to improve. Or not? Is it some type of a diagnostic test, or is it a test for merely a grade, merely a gateway, or both? My thought would be washback is always good. Provide as much of it as you can. Now, it may mean that you need to create or devise more assessments because as you use the assessments for washback, for feedback, may mean that you're not going to be able to use it again in a later exam, later assessment. Lastly, will the test be used to augment, to change the teaching materials? Will the materials here, will the test help you revise your course? And just something you want to think about as you're developing, right, is what's the purpose of the test, okay? Other language test designing questions, right? Again, we've already talked about the purpose of the test. What are the objectives of the test? Are they written out? Are they spelled out? How will the test specifications align with the objectives? You need to make sure that the tests that you're making fit with the course. So these things are coming together, that you're not creating a test that doesn't align with whatever the course objectives are. So you make sure that the purpose of the test fits in with the objectives of the course. Next question. How will the test items be selected? How will they be arranged? And that's going to be an issue. How are you going to be doing this? Are you doing it in some chronological order? Is it a random order? Is there a reason for the chronology or the randomness? If I'm teaching a history course, and in fact many of the history courses I've taken, the test developers were deliberate in putting the information in historical order, so that earlier questions dealt with older information or older events, and as opposed to the later questions on the test, which were posed to later events. Or do you want it random? Which ones are you selecting? Are you selecting specific ones for specific course objectives? Are you letting the computer choose? And I have seen there are programs that do that. Give me 50 random questions. And so you want to be careful. You want to make sure that what you're selecting is actually being geared toward the objectives that you want to test, the objectives that you want to measure. Number 5, how will the test giver provide optimal environment for taking the test? Again, that's test administration. What are you going to do to ensure that everything is optimal for the language learners? Are you providing a good place to take the test? Are you providing a good place to be relaxed and complete the work successfully? Okay. What kind of grading feedback are you going to offer for this? It needs to be decided as you're developing the test. What kind of grade, what kind of feedback are you going to give? And again, my thought would be the more washback, positive washback that you can give, the better it's going to be for your students. And that, to me, is the real key, motivating students to want to continue moving forward. With regard to the objectives, the elements within the test, objectives need to be clearly defined. They need to be measurable. They need to be doable, right? Objectives that are in context and can be tested in the assessment being created. When you go and decide that you're going to create an objective, you need to define it in such a way that it's actually doable, that it's actually measurable, right? Sometimes I hear students say, I want to speak English better. Well, that's a laudable goal, but it's not measurable. You need to find ways where you can actually measure so that you can give a point value or a score or a description to that measurable activity. Okay, so you're giving a speaking test, for example. Maybe you could be testing for the ability to politely refuse, politely decline. And you have to define that and what parameters that need to be involved in that. And so that when you're creating a speaking assessment, and one of the goals is to politely refuse, politely decline, that needs to be in there. Is it doable? Is it measurable? Okay? For every objective. Okay? Now, there are times where I may create a test that's got, let's just say it's got 50 multiple choice questions. And maybe I have 25 objectives. Each objective gets 2 questions, for example. Every question that you're going to put, every assessment element that you're going to put within the assessment should be measurable, should be doable, so that you can assign a point value to it, whether it's a rubric, a rich description, or a number. It needs to be measurable within that context. Very important. If this is not clearly done, then the test loses a lot of reliability. Test specifications should include a rich description of the test items, the tasks, the skills to be used. Okay, it should provide a description of how the test will be scored, how it will be reported. This information will not be given to the student per se. Actually, some of the test descriptions might. But all the other information you want to write down so that you know how to build the test. Okay? This is part of the recipe for building a test, building an assessment. And it should be described in such a way so that someone else who picks this up says, I can reproduce this. Just like a recipe. Just like a computer program. Inside computer programs, oftentimes there's metadata that is within it, descriptions of what is going on within this particular program, so that it can be assessed, analyzed, and reused or revised if necessary. So that metadata is important. Okay. Test specifications should also include detailed information for each item type. So if you have, let's just go with your standard test items, like a multiple choice or a fill in the blank or a matching, you should describe what these things are going to be. If I'm going to be creating a multiple choice question for this test, it needs to have, these many components. It needs to have 4 options or 5 options. It needs to have only one answer, only one clear answer. Okay, that should be written in here somewhere. Fill in the blank is only going to be one word, or it can be multiple word, or so that the descriptions are there, so anybody who wants to add or modify the test knows how it's supposed to be developed. So you should have a definition for each item type. You should have simple and clearly understood directions. That's for both the test takers and the test developers. You should also have rubrics or some evaluative scheme. If you're going to be using just straight numbers, that's going to be a little easier. If you're going to be developing a rubric to assess a presentation or a speech or a paper, those rubrics should be defined, clearly defined, so that, again, someone coming in will know how to use these materials. You also. right? You create a target and then you can stay on it. If you don't create a target, you're going to meander around, right? So you want a clear specification so you can follow it. I also tell people that after you clearly define these things, then you know how to deviate from it. Because after it's defined, well, then you know I can tweak it this way. Or if it's not defined, you don't know how to tweak it. So the first thing you want to do is have clearly defined, measurable, doable descriptions. Let's move on here. Some of the skills that you may test for different assessments, okay, in your designs here. For listening, just for examples, that's all these are. You can test minimal pairs. You can test note-taking skills. You can test for cohesive devices. Do they hear that when they're listening to a presentation? You can do listening for comprehension, listening for vocabulary, listening for the gist or for context. Again, cohesive devices. I have that on there twice. Why is that? Reading tests, reading assessments. You can do word recognition. Are they recognizing a word? You can do testing for things like clustering or skimming or scanning. Reading for the gist, reading for specific information. Higher up, you can do things like their ability to imply or to infer. Students' ability to summarize, if they were to summarize what they've read, or if they were to evaluate or criticize. All different things that you can use as items in a reading section or a reading assessment. Writing assessment, you can do things like sentence creation, the development of paragraphs or essays or research paper. You can go through the modes. You can write, letter writing, writing a narrative essay, a story, writing an academic paper, writing a thesis, the writing process, topic sentences, hooks, threads, intros, conclusions, all elements that you can that can be the foundation for assessment items, depending on where your students are, depending on their levels. For speaking, a speaking test, this whole system here, which is warm-ups, level checks, probing questions, and wind down, really comes from the work with Actville and their speaking tests. Basically, a warm-up is where you begin this interview with your student, and it's kind of light conversation, and you want them to feel relaxed and get them comfortable with what's going on. And then you go to a level check where you try to push these students up to a point where they're, can they make this level? I push them up. Can they make this level? And I'm pushing them up, both linguistically and both syntactically and lexically, as well as any of the functional elements that you may have within your scope and sequence. Eventually, you'll get to a place where you think, okay, this is the level that they're at, and you begin to probe into areas above to see if they can do any of those things. You're basically getting to them to the point where they break, where they can do something above here, but they can't do something here, and you're trying to find where that upper level is so that you can assess them. And then after that, you bring them down. You wind them down with a type of close, so to end the type of interview. We'll talk more about speaking assessments later on, but that's basically how those work. And so you can see, even within the 4 skills, we didn't even talk about the 2 databases, there are a lot of components that you can focus on as your items that you're going to assess as you go through the process. Let's take a closer look at this whole idea of using multiple choice questions. As you know, there are many tests out there, the ACT, the SAT, the TOEFL, the TOEIC, the CELT, the Michigan. There are a lot of tests out there that use multiple choice questions because of their practicality and reliability, although some would say that it has less validity than the others. Leave that aside. They're used a great deal, and so if you're going to be using them, you're going to want to know how to set them up. There's a lot of research that backs up the use of multiple choice items. Now, there are downsides, and eventually we're going to run into some of those, but you should look and see what it means to set up, what's involved in setting up multiple choice. Issues, as I've already said, they are practical, they are reliable. Downside is that they only assess passive or receptive knowledge. In other words, the students don't have to actually do anything rather than select A, B, C, or D type of thing. They're not doing anything with the language, so it's all receptive, okay? And that's not necessarily bad. This is the way I would say it. It's necessary, but it's certainly not sufficient in language assessment. So it's good in that sense. It is practical, but it only assesses passive knowledge, okay, receptive knowledge. It also limits washback in some sense, and it also limits what can be tested. So performance type things are going to be more difficult to be tested this way because it's receptive. It's also can be impacted by cheating and guessing. Years ago, when I had read an article or research on the TOEFL test, the score, this is years ago now, this isn't recently, the score was reliable with a plus or minus 14. So if you got a 514 on the TOEFL, your score could really be as low as 500 or as high as 528. There was this plus or minus. Part of that had to do with the guessing abilities within it. The other thing that can be done is cheating, whether the cheating is by that individual person or via some technology, or as we have seen recently in the 2000s, where people have hired other people to go take their test. And so people have cheated in order to do well on these tests. That would be negative washback, in my opinion. But that is going to be an issue with regard to multiple choice questions. The ability to cheat. You have to find some ways to circumvent that. A multiple choice item has these three basic elements. It has the stem, or basically the sentence, or the phrase, or the content at the beginning. Okay. It also has the key, which would be the answer, and then it has distractors. And so, say for example, you have a question that has 5 possible options. Well, one of them is going to be the key. The other 4 are distractors. And so you need to recognize what those things are. Again, when we talked earlier about setting up and describing each of these items, you should set up a description for the multiple choice item. That it should be, something that is at least one question, or one sentence, no more than 6 sentences, and it's got to have the one question, only one possible answer that's obvious, and then so many distractors that you're going to allow, and maybe you'll allow, between 4 and 6. That's going to be up to that description. Once the description's made, of course, then you follow those rules. Each multiple choice should test only one objective. So each question that you have should only be looking for one objective, okay? That seems kind of obvious, but again, if you're developing tests and you've never done it before, you just need to make sure you're only testing one item, one thing. Ensure that the key is clear and obvious, okay? And then assess created items using item facility and item discrimination. Analyze the questions that you make. Are they good questions? And you can do that using the statistical analysis of item facility and item discrimination. What's item facility? It identifies how easy or difficult a test item is to the group of test takers. So let's just say you've got 20 test takers, and all 20 of them get the answer right. Okay? That's going to indicate to you that it was an easy test question. Okay? If nobody gets it right, now you're looking at it and saying, maybe there's something wrong with the question, because some of my good students should have gotten it right. Right? I should see some kind of a bell curve type of thing when I'm looking at questions like this. So if nobody gets this question right, that's a flag for me. There may be something wrong with that question. Or I can see, if everybody gets it right, I'm thinking, this is maybe not a good question because it's too easy. The thing that I'm testing, either they all know, then I don't need to necessarily test it, or it's not actually testing that, or the answer is too obvious. Something may be up there. Okay, so that's item facility. Item discrimination identifies how well a test item discriminates between high-scoring recipients and low-scoring recipients. In other words, let's just say we've got 20 people who took the test. 10 of them got it right, 10 of them got it wrong. Okay, so item facility-wise, that's pretty good. I gotta somewhat balance here. When I go and look at the item discrimination, I notice that all of my good students got the answer right, and all of my weaker students didn't get the answer right. Okay, this leads me to think, okay, this is a good question. Because the people who are studying, the people who are doing well, the people who are showing initiative and motivation and desire, they're doing well getting the, and the other ones aren't. Okay. Now, if it's the other way around, my good students are all getting it wrong and my bad students are getting them all right, now I'm thinking, something may be wrong with that particular test question. So the purpose of item facility and item discrimination is to analyze the test questions. Are they really testing what you intended for them to test, right? Is there some screw up somewhere in the question so that there's a problem? Is the question necessary? There are a number of things that you can do with these two items. Then you can also look at distractor efficiency. How efficient are the distractors? Identifies how effective or ineffective the distractors are at luring someone away. And so you may, for example, you look at all the students who've answered question 15 and nobody selected D. Well, D might be a bad distractor because it's not luring students away. And again, you may find a couple other ones are some people are picking that one. Okay, well then those may be good distractors. I may want to change a distractor. You can see that it's within this frame here right now that you're looking at up there. It's with these up here that you're looking at where I can now begin to look at my questions and say, are these good questions or aren't they? This is where that place is. You set up your design, you set up your specifications, you write the test questions, and now you're going to go look at them and you can analyze them. Again, this is multiple choice questions. Item facility, item discrimination, and distractor efficiency. Let's go actually look at the formulas for setting these up. For item facility, it's the total number of students answering the item correctly, okay, divided by the total number of students responding to the item. And you can set this up rather easily within an ESL spreadsheet, right? You find out the total number of students and the total number that they got correct, and you'll be able to get your item facility number for each question. Item discrimination, you need to break your course up into groups, a high group and a low group. So the highest scores and the middle scores and the low scores, and then you use the high and low in order to do the item discrimination. You got 20 students and you've got maybe, let's just break it up evenly. 21 students, 7, 7, and 7. Use the upper 7 and upper 7 students, their highest scores, we'll use their tests, and the lower 7 students. And then we can compare. We do the high group number correct versus the low group number correct. And we divide that by one half times the total participants in the groups. Okay, so in our case it would be 14. But after you throw these into all this data into a spreadsheet, you'll be able to analyze this. By the way, there are some systems out there, some computer-based systems, that will do these for you. For example, the Moodle Course Content Management System. Moodle will allow you to go and do all of this automatically. If you have a multiple choice question, it can tell you what the item facility, the item discrimination numbers are for each question. So this type of work is already done for you if you're using a system like that. Yay! If you're not using a system like that, you'll have to take this data and put it into some form of a database or a spreadsheet so that you can analyze it. But this is important stuff when you're developing tests because it's going to help you recognize and improve the reliability of your test questions. Okay, let's jump on to administering the test. Administering the test, you provide for pre-test considerations. Again, you prepare the room, you prepare the AV. You might offer a quick checklist for your students. Hey, here's a checklist of the items that I'm going to be covering in the test. You might allow them to do a Q&A before the test begins. Allow them to ask questions about the test. Also, teachers, please arrive early. Prepare the room, prepare the materials. Make sure that you're there before your students do. When you give the test, notify students of the remaining time if it's a timed test. Oftentimes I would just write the number on the board so that I don't bother people who are going, but I want to let them know. If it's an online time test, somewhere there's going to be a timer. And by the way, from my own personal experience listening to my students, they hate time tests online because they see that little ticker in the clock or that's ticking away and think, they really don't like it. It really bothers them. But suffice it to say, also to be accessible for students if they have questions or problems. If you're online doing that, I would sit around in Skype or some chat window or Hangout so that they're ready for you in case they do have questions regarding certain questions. Lastly, for administering the test, we're going to look at scoring, grading, and giving feedback. Now, obviously, before you give the test, you need to determine a scoring rubric. You need to weight the items if you're going to weigh any of them. Question number 15 is worth double what all the other ones are, for example. So you need to decide that ahead of time. This is more important, so it gets a greater weight. You need to review and revise the rubrics and the item weights. Okay, make sure that everything is in play, and as you go through iterations of giving the test, you're going to be revising things. You need to determine a grading scale, okay, whether it's 80, 90, 90, 80, 70, 60, or the 92, 85 type of thing. That's going to be up to you, but you should determine what it is, how it is that we determine a grade. And then lastly, provide feedback. And I do recommend that you do give feedback if it's at all possible, not just a grade or the score, but the raw data, how many test items they got right and wrong. You can do this individually. You can do this in groups. You can do it in an entire class. So if you're doing the entire class, you can just give more generic information. 20 people got this question wrong, 30 people got this question wrong, and we can actually go through it in class as a kind of activity. Which will enable them to look at these problems and think about them, look at the issues and think about them, look at the scoring, okay, find out why they got what they got, or in groups or individually. When I do writing assessments, one of the things that I do is I encourage students to give feedback to each other. And we go through this whole process of peer feedback and giving peer feedback. And one of the things that I typically do is I take some of these snippets of the peer feedback and I show it to the entire class. Okay, so when they read that snippet, now they don't know who did it, but they just see it up there. And I ask, is this good feedback or isn't it? And then they respond. Now, of course, the student who gave the feedback is somewhere in the room. I don't know who it is. I don't even remember. But they now know that's theirs, and they're now going, oh, I need to give better feedback. I need to give better information. Providing an opportunity to share this with the entire class is definitely an impetus to encourage them to do better when providing feedback. Scoring, grading, and giving feedback. And that's all I have for this particular little lecture here on language assessment, designing language tests. I do thank you for stopping by. If you do have any questions, you can certainly drop a note below, and I'll be glad to try to answer your questions. Talk to you later now. Bye-bye.